Welcome back to Family Shadows, the channel where we tell stories of fathers, quiet men, steady men, who give everything for their families and sometimes learn the hardest lessons about love, sacrifice, and dignity. If these stories touch your heart, I invite you to subscribe and stay with us. Your support helps us keep these family tales alive, reminding the world that the quiet strength of a father should never be overlooked. Tonight's story is titled, "My son said I was holding him back, so I let him fall without my support." Edward Lane was 65 years old, a widower, a builder, and above all, a father. His life had never been about riches or fame. Instead, it was about slow mornings, the smell of sawdust on his hands, and the quiet satisfaction of coming home after a long day, knowing he had built something solid, not just houses, but a future for his children. Edward was the kind of man you might pass on the street without noticing. His hair had turned gray years ago, his shoulders slightly stooped from decades of carrying beams and lumber. Yet there was a steadiness about him, a gentleness in his eyes, the kind you only find in men who have weathered storms and still choose kindness. He lived alone now, in the house he had once shared with his beloved wife, Evelyn. 8 years had passed since cancer had taken her, and in those years, Edward had learned the ache of silence. The dinner table that once held laughter now held only his plate, his fork, and the echo of memories. But Edward's heart still beat for his children. Michael Lane, 32 years old, was his pride, his joy, and sometimes his greatest worry. Michael was ambitious, brilliant with technology, full of big dreams. He had left his steady job in the city to start his own company, a tech startup he believed would change the way contractors managed their projects. And then there was Anna, Edward's daughter, 28, thoughtful and practical. She had her mother's calm eyes and her father's patience, though she often carried unspoken worries about the choices her brother made. To Edward, they were his world. Everything he had done, the overtime shifts, the nights spent repairing old trucks, the money quietly saved, was for them. But what happens when the love you give, the sacrifices you make, are seen not as support, but as an obstacle? Edward's mornings were simple. He would wake before the sun, shuffle into the kitchen in his socks, and pour himself coffee into the same cracked mug he'd used for 20 years. The mug had a faint line down the handle, a small scar from being dropped once on the garage floor. Most people would have replaced it. Edward didn't. Some things, like some people, earned their place at the table no matter their flaws. On his refrigerator, 2 photos were pinned side by side. One was of Anna, smiling in her wedding dress, her husband's arm wrapped proudly around her. The other was of Michael as a boy, no older than 14, standing proudly next to the first computer they had built together. Edward could still remember that night, the glow of the monitor lighting Michael's face, the boy's voice cracking with excitement. "It works, Dad. It really works." For Edward, that was one of the proudest moments of his life. Not because the computer turned on, but because he had seen the fire in his son's eyes, the fire of possibility. Years later, that same fire had grown into something bigger, something riskier. Michael wanted to build a company of his own, and Edward, being who he was, stood behind him, not just with words, but with everything he had. When the bank asked for collateral, Edward signed. When investors wanted reassurance, Edward was the quiet figure in the room, a father who believed in his son. He even put his house on the line, though he never once mentioned it to Michael, because that's what fathers do. They carry the weight so their children can walk freely. Edward believed his support was love, but Michael would come to see it differently. On Sundays, Anna sometimes asked her father, "Are you safe, Dad, with all the money you've tied up in Michael's company?" Edward would only smile, place his weathered hand over hers and say, "I know what I'm doing." He meant it. At least, he thought he did. For Edward, safety was not about numbers on a paper. Safety was about trust, the belief that the seeds he had planted in his children would grow into strong trees, able to stand on their own. Still, when the nights grew quiet and the walls of the house sighed with age, Edward sometimes found himself staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had done too much. Wondering if his steady hand had, unknowingly, become a crutch his son leaned on too heavily. Michael's startup was a small office with whiteboards covered in plans, a couch sagging from sleepless nights, and a coffee machine that never rested. Edward loved visiting on Fridays, bringing a bag of bagels for the young team. He would shake their hands, ask about their families, and remind them to take breaks. To them, Edward wasn't just Michael's father. He was a presence, a reminder that someone believed in them, someone steady enough to lean on. And to Edward, those visits were a joy. They made him feel useful again, part of something bigger than himself. But underneath all the optimism, there were cracks. Investors grew cautious. Deadlines slipped. And Michael, though brilliant, began to feel the pressure. He loved his father, but sometimes he felt smothered by him. He felt the shadow of Edward's sacrifices looming too large over his dreams. And Edward, with all his good intentions, didn't see it coming. The storm was near. The words were coming, words that would pierce deeper than any debt, deeper than any failure. Words no father should ever have to hear. That night at the dinner table, Edward would face a truth that would shake him more than any storm on a construction site. But that is for Chapter 2. Dinner at Michael's apartment was supposed to be simple. A Friday evening, a promise of home-cooked pasta, and maybe, Edward thought, a little laughter to soften the long week. He arrived carrying a bottle of sparkling cider under his arm, Evelyn's old tradition. Every time she was invited anywhere, she brought something, even if it was small. Edward kept that ritual alive, a quiet way of honoring her. The apartment smelled of garlic and olive oil. Michael moved around the kitchen with quick, confident hands, tossing noodles into a pot, adding sauce from a pan that simmered too fast. Taylor, his girlfriend, set plates on the table. She greeted Edward warmly, almost apologetically, as if she knew something he didn't. They sat together. The first bites were pleasant enough. Edward complimented the sauce, Michael grinned, and for a few minutes the table carried the warmth of family again. But warmth doesn't always last. Sometimes it flickers like a candle when the window is cracked. Michael leaned back in his chair, twirling pasta on his fork, and with a half smile that tried too hard to sound casual, he said, "Dad, I need to tell you something. I think you're holding me back." The words landed harder than thunder in a clear sky. Edward's fork froze above his plate. He looked at his son, not angry, not even confused at first, just quiet, as if waiting for a punchline that never came. Michael went on quickly, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "Every time I meet with investors, they see you standing behind me. They see the loans, the guarantees, the house you put on the line. They don't see me. They think my company exists because you're propping it up. If you really love me, Dad, step aside. Let me prove myself without you. Stop interfering." Edward's chest tightened. He had weathered storms on scaffolds, he had seen walls collapse, but nothing compared to these words. He set his fork down slowly, as if the table might splinter under his weight. For years, he had believed that his quiet presence, his financial safety net, his Friday bagels, were the proof of his love. And now his son, his boy with the bright blue eyes, was calling it a chain. Across the table, Taylor lowered her gaze, pressing her napkin nervously. She said nothing. And Anna, Edward's daughter, who had joined them that evening, looked at her father with soft, conflicted eyes. She had warned him before, gently, that Michael needed more space. But even she hadn't expected her brother to speak so coldly. Edward wanted to respond. Words swirled in his mind like loose nails spilling across a floor. You don't know how many nights I've saved you. You don't know the debts I've carried so you could still dream. You don't know the price of silence. But he didn't say any of it. He simply breathed deeply and nodded. Michael mistook the silence for agreement. It's time I stand on my own, Dad. No more safety nets. No more guarantees. If I fail, I fail, but it'll be my failure. Anna reached for her father's hand under the table, squeezing it gently, her eyes brimming with sympathy. Edward squeezed back, a signal that he was all right, even though inside a quiet fracture spread across his heart. The rest of the dinner was a blur. The pasta cooled, the candle sputtered, and conversation drifted into shallow waters about the weather and weekend plans. But beneath it all, the sentence kept echoing, "You're holding me back." When the plates were cleared, Edward stood to leave. Michael hugged him quickly at the door, already turning back to his laptop, already thinking about tomorrow's pitch. On the drive home, the streetlights passed like slow metronomes against the windshield. Edward's hand stayed steady on the wheel, but inside, the weight of his son's words pressed heavy. He thought of Evelyn. He thought of all the nights he had carried both father and mother for their children. And he wondered, had his love become a burden? When he pulled into his driveway, the house greeted him with its usual silence. He sat in the car for a long time before going inside. The mums on the porch waited patiently, their burnt orange petals bowing in the cool air. Finally, Edward whispered to himself, maybe it's time to let go. And with that, the decision began to take root. That night after Michael's words, Edward could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak with its old bones, the clock ticking each second with merciless precision. "You're holding me back." The phrase kept circling in his head, as if the walls themselves were whispering it back to him. He turned to Evelyn's side of the bed, empty for nearly a decade, and for the first time in many months he spoke aloud into the darkness. "Did I do too much, Evie? Did I give so much that he forgot the cost?" The silence offered no answer, only the wind against the windows and the weight of memory. Edward had never been the kind of man to boast. He had built a career in construction, one house, one beam, one paycheck at a time. Every dollar he ever earned seemed to have a destination before it even touched his hands. Mortgage, groceries, school supplies, braces, a college tuition bill that arrived with the weight of an anvil. And yet somehow he managed. Not because he was rich, but because he was careful. Edward Lane knew how to stretch a dollar until it sang. He drove the same truck for 20 years, patched the same boots more times than he could count, and wore his work jackets until the elbows gave out. When Michael wanted his first computer at 14, Edward sold his old hunting rifle, a rifle that had belonged to his father. He never told Michael the trade. He just handed the boy the box and smiled at the way his son's eyes lit up. When Anna needed textbooks for nursing school, Edward worked weekends fixing decks and patching roofs, even though his knees ached from climbing ladders. He would come home sore, but always with enough cash folded neatly into her hand. Sacrifice had become his second language, but Michael never knew the full extent. He never knew that the first line of credit for his startup had nearly cost Edward his home. The bank wanted collateral, and Edward had placed the deed of his modest house on the table. He had signed with steady hands, even though his stomach churned. He never knew that when the second loan came due, and the business was burning through cash faster than it earned, Edward had quietly emptied a retirement account he had been saving for decades. Not all of it, just enough to cover the shortfall, enough to give his son a fighting chance. He never knew the meetings Edward had endured with stern-faced bankers who asked, "Are you sure about this, Mr. Lane? At your age, it's a risk." And Edward, with his soft voice and unwavering eyes, had always answered, "Yes, he deserves the chance." Not once did he mention these things at the dinner table. Not once did he lay the weight of his choices on Michael's shoulders, because in Edward's mind, a father's job was to build the floor his children stood on, not to remind them of the beams beneath their feet. There were smaller sacrifices too, the kind you'd only notice if you paid attention. The vacations he never took. The old watch he kept repairing instead of replacing. The house repairs he postponed, like the leaky roof that he patched himself rather than hire help. He skipped dentist appointments, delayed buying new glasses, wore the same suit to every wedding and funeral for 20 years. Each choice was invisible to his children, but to Edward they were acts of love. Sometimes, when he was alone, he would take out a folder he kept in his desk. Inside were the receipts, the loan statements, the papers that bore his signature. He would trace his name with his finger and think, this is the story behind his dream. This is the scaffolding he never sees. And yet, he never felt regret. Not once. Because every time he walked into Michael's office and saw the team huddled around a screen, fighting to make something work, he felt proud. He saw young people with passion in their eyes, and he thought, maybe this is worth everything. But after that dinner, after hearing his son say he was holding him back for the first time, doubt entered his heart. Had he mistaken enabling for love? Had he built so many bridges that his son never learned to swim? Edward folded the papers back into the folder, placed it in the drawer, and shut it quietly. Then he sat in his chair by the window, staring at the dark street outside, and whispered, "Maybe it's time he knows what it means to walk without me." The sacrifices had been hidden all his life, but soon the truth of them would shape the hardest decision he had ever made. The following week, Edward woke with a heaviness in his chest he could no longer ignore. He moved through his morning routine, coffee in the cracked mug, toast a shade too dark, the quiet rustle of the newspaper, but none of it felt steady anymore. Michael's words clung to him, "You're holding me back, step aside." For a man like Edward, words were bricks. Once spoken, they carried weight. And those bricks had been laid across his heart, pressing down with each passing day. He stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing his plate, and saw the reflection of his own tired face in the window. Behind it, the autumn leaves swirled across the yard, branches shedding what they could no longer hold. He understood. Even the strongest trees know when to let go. That morning, Edward put on his best shirt, the one Evelyn used to iron before church, and drove into town, not to Michael's office, not to the grocery store, but to the bank. The branch smelled of paper and polish. The young woman at the counter greeted him with a professional smile, but when he asked to speak with the loan officer, her expression shifted into something softer, as if she sensed the weight he carried in his voice. They led him into a small office. The loan officer, a man in his 40s with a tie too tight at the collar, pulled up Edward's file on the screen. Rows of numbers glowed back at them, loans, guarantees, balances, all tied to Michael's company. And at the bottom of it all, the deed to Edward's home, the very roof that had sheltered his family for decades. Edward cleared his throat. His hands rested flat on the desk, rough from years of labor but steady as stone. "I want to withdraw," he said simply. The loan officer blinked. "Withdraw? My guarantee, my support, whatever you call it. I want to take my name off his back." The officer frowned, leaning forward. "Mr. Lane, you understand what that means. Without your backing, the company may not survive another quarter. The bank will tighten lending. Investors may pull out. It could," he paused, searching for a polite word, "collapse." Edward nodded slowly. "I know." The officer hesitated. "And your son, does he know about this decision?" Edward looked down at his hands. The lines across his palms were deep, like fault lines of a long life lived in service. "No," he said quietly, "he doesn't." He signed the papers with the same hand that had signed every loan before. But this time there was no trembling, no hesitation, only a calm, heavy resolve. When the pen left the page, it felt as though he had placed a stone back onto the earth that he had been carrying on his shoulders for years. The officer slid the papers into a folder, his eyes flicking between duty and sympathy. This is a big step, Mr. Lane, are you certain?" Edward met his gaze with the quiet firmness of a man who had raised children, buried a wife, and spent his life building walls that withstood storms. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes the best way to love is to step aside." On the drive home, the world seemed sharper. The trees glowed brighter with their fading leaves. The sky stretched wider, yet Edward felt the ache of what he had done. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was something far more painful, love expressed as absence. He remembered Evelyn's words years ago when Michael had taken his first job. "Don't catch him every time he falls, Ed. A boy learns more from a scraped knee than from a steady hand." Back then, Edward had smiled, believing he could balance both love and protection, freedom and safety. But now he finally understood. At home, he placed the bank folder in the drawer with the others. Except this one felt different. It wasn't a sacrifice to support his son. It was a sacrifice to let him fail. He sat by the window as dusk settled, the street lamps flickering on one by one. His thoughts drifted to Michael, so full of drive, so blind to the scaffolding beneath him. Edward whispered into the quiet room, "I hope one day you'll see. All I ever wanted was for you to stand on your own." And for the first time in years, he let the silence be his answer. It didn't happen all at once. Failure rarely does. It arrives in small cracks, first invisible, then undeniable. A few weeks after Edward withdrew his support, Michael walked into his office on Maple Street and sensed something was different. The air felt heavier. The team that once buzzed with optimism now sat quieter, their laughter replaced with the dull clatter of keyboards. That morning, 2 investors who had once promised follow-up funding canceled their meeting. An email from the bank arrived, cold and precise. "Due to updated risk assessments, your line of credit has been reduced." Michael read the words twice, then 3 times. His chest tightened. He forwarded the message to his co-founder with the subject line, "We'll figure it out." But even as he typed, a chill crept into his spine. Payroll became harder to meet. Vendors who had once given generous timelines for payments suddenly demanded cash up front. The landlord of their small office asked for reassurances, hinting at rumors that the company was unstable. The truth was spreading faster than Michael could contain it. Without his father's guarantee, the safety net was gone. For the first time, he felt naked in the business world, exposed without the silent strength of Edward Lane standing behind him. At night, Michael lay awake on the couch in his office. staring at the ceiling tiles, listening to the faint hum of the servers. His mind raced with numbers, burn rate, deadlines, contracts slipping through his fingers. He remembered the dinners with investors when his father's quiet presence in the room had been both comfort and anchor. Back then, he thought it was a shadow he needed to escape. Now he wondered if it had been the only thing holding the light steady. Meanwhile, Edward carried on with his routines. He raked leaves in the yard, fixed the squeak in Mrs. Delgado's gate next door, and baked a pie for the church fundraiser. To anyone watching, he looked unchanged, a steady, ordinary man living an ordinary life. But inside, he felt the tremors of his son's struggle. Anna called one evening. Her voice was heavy. "Dad, Michael's having a hard time. He hasn't told you, but I can see it. The company's under real pressure." Edward listened quietly. He wanted to ask questions, to drive across town, to step through the office door with another bag of bagels, but he didn't. He remembered the words, sharp as broken glass. "You're holding me back." So instead he said softly, "He's strong, Anna. Let him find his way." But when he hung up the phone, Edward sat in his chair by the window and pressed his hands together, whispering the kind of prayer only fathers know, the prayer that asks for mercy on the child who doesn't yet understand mercy. At Michael's office, the cracks widened. The scheduling tool glitched during a contractor's biggest project, costing them a deal. A potential client walked away, citing instability. The investors who had once promised loyalty grew silent, their calls unanswered. And through it all, Michael felt the weight he had once longed for, the true weight of standing alone. He looked at the faces of his team, bright, hopeful, now dimmed with doubt, and for the first time he couldn't find the words to reassure them. He wanted to call his father. He wanted to hear Edward's calm voice, the one that always made storms seem survivable, but pride held the phone heavy in his pocket. At the end of one long day, Michael stood by the office window. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, just as they did outside his father's house. He pressed his forehead to the glass and whispered into the empty room, "Dad, I thought I was ready, but maybe I wasn't." The struggles had only just begun, and the fall was coming. Winter came early that year. The mornings were sharper, the streets dusted with frost, and in Michael's office, the chill seemed to settle deeper than the weather outside. The whiteboards that had once been crowded with plans now stood half erased. The markers dried out, their promises fading like echoes. The couch in the corner sagged under the weight of sleepless nights, and the coffee pot rarely brewed more than half a pot these days. It happened slowly, then suddenly. First, a contractor canceled their contract, frustrated with glitches in the platform. Then another investor, wary of the shrinking runway, pulled their funding entirely. Soon, the numbers on Michael's spreadsheets shifted from tight to impossible. Payroll slipped, bills piled up, vendors stopped answering his calls. One Friday afternoon, as the office lights flickered above him, Michael gathered his team. Their faces, young, tired, some still hopeful, looked back at him in silence. He cleared his throat, tried to steady his voice. We don't have the resources to keep going. I thought we could push through, but without backing, without new contracts, there's no runway left. I'm sorry." A woman in the back wiped her eyes. Another young man nodded quietly as if he'd already known. One by one, they packed their laptops, their notebooks, their dreams into bags and boxes. No one blamed him aloud, but Michael felt the blame hang in the air like smoke. When the last person left, he sat alone at his desk, staring at the empty room. The hum of the servers was gone. Even the dartboard on the wall seemed to mock him with its bright, useless circles. That night, Michael walked home through the cold. His hands were buried in his pockets, but the chill still reached his bones. His phone buzzed with unanswered calls from creditors, partners, voices that had once sounded like allies and now sounded like wolves. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alone. He thought of his father, of Edward standing quietly at the edge of every meeting, of Edward signing papers without complaint, of Edward's steady bag of bagels every Friday morning. And he thought of the words he had spoken across the dinner table weeks ago. "You're holding me back." How sharp they had sounded then. How foolish they sounded now. Back at Edward's house, the old man sat in his chair by the window, the same place he always sat when the world grew heavy. He hadn't heard from Michael in days, but he didn't need a phone call to know what was happening. Fathers often feel the tremors before the quake. He looked at the drawer with the bank folder inside. For the 100th time, he wondered if he had done the right thing. But then he remembered Evelyn's voice again. "Don't catch him every time he falls, Ed. A boy learns more from a scraped knee than from a steady hand." He closed his eyes and whispered, "Lord, help him find his footing in the fall." In the city, Michael's office lease was terminated. The keys he once carried with pride now jingled in his hand like shackles. He dropped them in the landlord's box and walked away without looking back. Days blurred together, calls with lawyers, final notices, the heavy shame of failure settling on his shoulders. He stopped answering friends, stopped showing up to gatherings. Even Taylor, once his closest companion, began to drift away. All that remained was silence and the echo of a father's absence. One evening, sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, Michael buried his face in his hands. His voice cracked as he whispered into the emptiness. "Dad, I thought I could do it without you. I was wrong." The collapse of his dream was complete. But in the ruins, the faintest light began to flicker, the possibility of humility, the chance to finally see the truth about the man who had always been there. The winter sky hung low the evening Michael drove back to his father's house. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every sound echo louder, the crunch of tires over frost, the rattle of the heater trying to keep up, the thud of his own heart in his chest. He had resisted this drive for weeks. Pride had kept him away. Pride had silenced the phone calls he wanted to make, swallowed the words he wanted to say. But now, with his company gone, his apartment emptying into cardboard boxes, and his own reflection looking back at him like a stranger, there was nowhere else left to go. The porch light was on, just as it always had been, a beacon against the cold. The same mums Edward had planted in autumn still stood by the steps, their petals brittle but brave against the frost. Michael paused there, one hand on the railing, remembering how many times his father's steady hands had guided him up these very steps. Inside, Edward was in his chair by the window, a book resting closed in his lap. He heard the door creak open and looked up. His son stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes tired, carrying not success or pride, but the weight of defeat. For a long moment neither spoke. Only the ticking of the old clock filled the silence. Finally, Michael's voice cracked the air. It was softer than Edward had ever heard it. "Dad, I was wrong." The words broke something open inside the room. Edward rose slowly, placing the book aside, and walked to his son. He studied the face that once belonged to a boy with bright blue eyes who had marveled at their first computer, and now belonged to a man humbled by failure. Michael swallowed hard, tears brimming in his eyes. "I thought I didn't need you. I thought your support made me weak. But now I see it was never weakness. It was love, and I threw it back in your face." Edward's weathered hands rested on his son's shoulders, steady and forgiving. His voice was gentle, almost a whisper. "Life teaches lessons better than I ever could, son. Sometimes the hardest gift a father can give is letting go." Michael lowered his head, ashamed, but Edward lifted his chin with a soft hand. There was no anger in his eyes, no judgment. Only the deep, unshakable love of a father who had carried the weight of sacrifice in silence. For the first time in years, Michael embraced his father, not as a man leaning on a safety net, but as a son finally understanding where his strength had always come from. The warmth of that embrace filled the house, stronger than any fire in the hearth, brighter than any light in the window. Edward whispered into his son's ear, "Welcome home." The days that followed were quieter but also warmer. Michael stayed at his father's house for a while, helping with chores, fixing small things around the yard, and for the first time in years, listening more than he spoke. The office downtown was gone, but at the dinner table he discovered something greater: the steadiness of his father's presence, the kind of wealth no investor could measure. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sky fade into twilight, Michael asked softly, "Dad, did it hurt, letting me fall?" Edward leaned back, his gaze steady on the horizon. "Every part of me wanted to catch you," he admitted. "But sometimes love isn't holding tighter. Sometimes love is letting go so you can find your own strength." Michael nodded, his eyes glistening, finally understanding the weight of those words. He realized now that his father's silence, his sacrifices, and even his decision to step back had been acts of love, painful acts but necessary ones. And Edward, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he wasn't carrying his son's dream on his back. He was simply sitting beside him, two men, father and son, sharing the same sky, the same quiet, the same love. In the end, the story of Edward Lane wasn't about wealth or failure or even success. It was about a father's love, the kind that builds silently, sacrifices quietly, and sometimes teaches best by stepping aside. Because sometimes, the most powerful way to hold on to your children is by letting go. Thank you, dear friends, for listening to this story tonight on Family Shadows. May it remind us all of the quiet strength of fathers, the patience of love, and the lessons we only learn through time. We wish you health, peace, and happiness in your own families. May your homes be filled with warmth, understanding, and love. Good night, and take care of one another.